Assalamu alaikum. My name is Taha Adil. I'm research economist at Prime. Prime has recently published its new report, Prime Plus, and Prime Plus is a quarterly report that provides in-depth analysis of Pakistan's economic policies and trends in macroeconomic indicators. So, in this presentation, we will have a look at the progress on pillars of economic prosperity, trends in macroeconomic indicators, and macroeconomic outlook. So, what are the pillars of economic prosperity? Well, there are six pillars: limited government, spending restraints, free trade, low tax rates, sound money, and privatization. These pillars are taken from a keynote address delivered by Dr. Arthur Laffer at Prime's annual conference in 2021. And Dr. Arthur evaluated the underlying causes of recurring economic crisis in Pakistan, and he highlighted these six pillars where reforms are inevitable to achieve economic prosperity. So the first pillar is limited government. The job of the government is to create business enabling environment and regulate the markets. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, government is involved in the businesses as well and has a presence in market by more than 60%. So in order to maintain its presence, government has to spend more money every year. If we look at this figure, federal current expenditures as a percentage of GDP, the share was around 11.6% in 2011, and it increased to around 12.7% in 2020, and then it declined to around 12.5% in 2022. But if we compare our expenditures with the revenue, then our expenditures are really high. The next component of the limited government is government regulations. Pakistan is a highly regulated country, and this creates problem for people to set up and operate businesses, but also for the government to administer these regulations. So, if you want to open a new restaurant, it takes around 5.7 months to get necessary approvals, and you have to visit 31 times different government offices, and the cost of regulation is around 110,000 rupees. Similarly, opening a cash and carry business takes around 5 months to get approvals, and cost of regulation is around 375,000 rupees. Registration of new medicine takes around 1.7 years, and cost of regulation is around 200,000 rupees. Getting a commercial electricity connection in Islamabad takes around 5 months, and cost of regulation is around 81,000 rupees. Similarly, obtaining intellectual property rights in Pakistan takes around 1.9 years, and cost of regulation is around 200,000 rupees. So this shows that regulations are high, and this increases the actually cost for setting up and operating businesses. The next pillar is spending restraint. Spending restraint implies that there should be efficient allocation of public resources. Unfortunately, our public expenditures are much higher than our revenue collection, and that is why government has to raise taxes every year and borrow from domestic and external sources. So the central government public debt in 2011 was around 10 trillion rupees, and it has increased to around 55 trillion rupees till the end of January 2023. This increase this increase comprises some fresh borrowing and increase in overall public debt due to interest rate hikes and currency devaluation. But if we look at the or spending patterns, then the biggest expenditure of the federal government is debt servicing, which is around 4.7% of GDP and 36% of the total budget. Next is subsidies, which is around 2.3% of GDP and around 16% of total expenditures. And the third is defense spending, which is around 2.1% of GDP and around 15% of total expenditures. So this shows that we are spending much higher than our revenues. The next pillar is low tax rates. As I mentioned earlier, that the federal government is spending more than it is earning. So the government has to increase taxes every year and rely more on indirect taxes, which is quite easier to collect. This graph shows that the effective tax rate on different salary salary or taxation system is progressive, and tax rates are quite high. So 600,000 annual income is tax exempted. Then the next slab is of 1.2 million annual income, and the tax rate is 1%. If you have 3.6 million annual income, the tax rate is around 11%. If your annual income is around 12 million, tax rate is 25%. And if annual income is around 24 million, tax rate is 30%. So beside this income tax, government has also imposed super tax, which is levied on the income greater than 150 million rupees. So high taxes actually discourages people to become a part of taxation system, and people uh, usually prefer to stay out of the tax base. And resultantly, this high tax rates promotes tax evasion and tax avoidance. Next pillar is sound money. Sound money implies that there should be a stable currency, and if the exchange rate policy of the government is frequently changing, then it makes currency highly volatile. If we compare Pakistan with other regional countries, then the exchange rate of India and Bangladesh has remained quite stable in last 10 years. The exchange rate of India was 59 Indian rupee in 2013, and it depreciated to around 82 Indian rupee in 2023. And if we look at Bangladesh, exchange rate was around 78 taka in 2013, and it depreciated to around 106 taka in 2023. In contrast, Sri Lanka and Pakistani currency has remained volatile, especially after COVID. Exchange rate of Pakistan was around 102 rupees in 2013, and it has depreciated to around 262 at the end of January 2023. So Pakistani currency has lost more value as compared to other regional countries. And in last 10 years, Pakistani rupee has depreciated by around 150%, and after COVID, it has depreciated by around 60%. One of the reasons behind currency devaluation is higher growth in money supply as compared to GDP growth. And if we look at the monetary growth, money supply was around 8.8 trillion in 2013, and it has increased to more than 27 trillion at the end of 2022. And if we compare the increase in money supply with the GDP growth, then growth in money supply has remained much higher than the GDP growth. And one of the reasons behind such an increase in money supply is continuous borrowing of government to finance public expenditures. Next pillar is to reduce trade barriers. Higher the trade barriers, lower will be the transfer of knowledge and technology, lower will be the integration in global value chains and economic activity in the country. And if we compare the average tariff rates of Pakistan with other countries, then the average tariff rate of Pakistan is around 11.2%, Bangladesh is 14%, India is 18.3%, China is 7.5%, Sri Lanka is 5.9%, Thailand is 11.5%, Vietnam is 9.6%. So Pakistan's average tariff is uh, lower than Bangladesh and India. But one thing that distinguishes Pakistan is that we have other trade barriers as well, such as sales tax, additional sales tax, regulatory duty, additional customs duty that increases the overall trade barriers. So but if we look at the trends of the last 10 years, the average tariff rate of Pakistan has decreased from 13.9% in 2011 to around 11.2% in 2021. And tariffs for agriculture sector has reduced by 17%, whereas non-agriculture tariffs were decreased to 10.9%. The sixth pillar is privatization. So privatization implies that we have to privatize loss-making state-owned enterprises. As we all know that our public sector enterprises are continuously incurring losses, and they are a huge burden on national exchequer. Right now, there are 212 SOEs, out of which 85 are commercial, 83 are subsidiaries of those SOEs, and 44 are non-commercial entities. Every year, government envisages to collect revenues in the form of privatization of these loss-making state-owned enterprises, but no significant progress has been made so far in last couple of years. So the next section of the report is macroeconomic analysis. Our first macroeconomic indicator is inflation. Inflation has remained a big challenge for government since the beginning or since the start of COVID-19 pandemic, and every CPI inflation in the third quarter of fiscal year 2023 stood at 31.5% as compared to 21.6% last year. And if we look at the ninth month CPI inflation, it is around 27.2%. Well, there are several reasons behind inflation, and which are currency devaluation, volatility in food and energy prices due to first from COVID-19 and then from Russia-Ukraine war. Then we had floods in Pakistan in the last year, and then there is import restriction, and then hike in utility prices. So all these factors have significantly contributed to inflation. Next indicator is revenue collection. So the government was able to collect around 1 trillion in first 2 months of the third quarter of fiscal year 2023 as compared to 873 billion last year. So there is some improvement in revenue collection. And if we look at the performance in first 8 months of the fiscal year 2023, then government collected around 4.5 trillion rupees, which is around 19% higher than last year. But still, there is a shortfall of around 200 billion, and that prompted the government to introduce finance supplementary bill to increase the taxes and generate more revenues. The next indicator is government domestic borrowing and outstanding position. So, in the first 2 months of the third quarter of fiscal year 2023, government borrowing from the domestic banking sector increased by around 1.3 trillion rupees, and it currently stood at around 21.7 trillion rupees. And in the same period last year, the borrowing declined by around 144 billion rupees. And if we look at the composition of the debt, state banks outstanding credit to the government increased by 239 billion rupees, but this is not due to fresh borrowing, but due to increase in the interest rate and currency devaluation. And if we look at the commercial banks outstanding credit to the government, it increased by around 1.15 trillion, and it currently stood at 16.1 trillion. So government is borrowing heavily from the banking sector to finance its public expenditures. The next macroeconomic indicator is foreign direct investment in the country. In the first 2 months of the third quarter of fiscal year 2023, government the FDI was net FDI was around $323 million, which was around $200 million last year. So there is some improvement in the net foreign direct investment. And inflow of FDI in these 2 months were $364.5 million, whereas the outflow was around $40 million. And if we look at the performance for the first 8 months of the fiscal year 2023, net FDI stood at $784 million, and as compared to last the FDI in last year was around $1.3 billion. So there is a decline of around $531 million in first 8 months of the fiscal year 2023. Next indicator is private sector borrowing from the banks. So private sector borrowing declined by around 219 billion in first 2 months of the third quarter of fiscal year 2023 as compared to the decline of around 76 billion last year. And the total private sector borrowing stood at around 7.4 trillion rupees. The fall in private sector borrowing can be attributed to significant hike in the interest rates and halt in manufacturing activities due to import restrictions. The long-term fixed financing increased by 8 billion in the first 2 months of the third quarter of fiscal year 2023, and short-term financing declined by 3 billion. Next macroeconomic indicator is current account balance. So the government was able to bring down the current account deficit, and it stood at around 304 million dollars in the first 2 months of the third quarter of fiscal year 2023. But this decline was achieved through administrative controls and import restrictions. And due to these restrictions, Pakistan's exports also declined by 17% in the third quarter of fiscal year 2023 as compared to last year, and the exports were around $6.8 billion dollars. Similarly, imports declined by around 30%, and it stood at around $12.7 billion dollars. And if we look at the remittances, then remittances declined by around 10% in third quarter of fiscal year 2023, and it stood at around $6.41 billion dollars. The decline in remittances can be attributed to exchange rate management by the government, and people started using informal banking channels to send money at home. The next macroeconomic indicator is the performance of large-scale manufacturing sector. The output of large-scale manufacturing sector rose by 1.48% in January as compared to December 2022, but it declined by around 8% if we compare January 2023 to January 2022. And in the first 7 months of the fiscal year 2023, large scale manufacturing sector output declined by around 4.4%. So the underlying reasons behind this decline is significant hike in the interest rates, political instability at home, and closure of businesses due to import restrictions. The next macroeconomic indicator is the exchange rate. The exchange rate has remained volatile in the third quarter of fiscal year 2023, and it fell by around 25% uh, from rupees 225 in December 2022 to rupees 282 at the end of March 2023. And one of the biggest reasons is political instability in the country. To The next indicator is market capitalization in the stock market, which actually shows the business environment in the country. And market capitalization fell by around 19% year on year basis in March 2023, and around 4.5% quarterly basis in fiscal year 2023. And the total market capitalization at the end of March 2023 was around 6.1 trillion rupees. So if we look at the macroeconomic outlook of the country, Pakistan is facing several challenges at the domestic and external front. If we talk about domestic challenges, the biggest challenge is political instability in the country, which will continue to increase until the schedule of elections are announced and general elections take place. The second problem is the IMF program, which has remained stalled for several months now, due to inability of the government to fulfill prerequisites to complete the ninth review of the IMF program. So, in the coming months, the program will remain suspended due to inability of the government to fulfill the requisites of ninth review. The next challenge is inflation. Due to supply chain disruptions and political instability and currency devaluation, inflationary pressures will persist in the coming few months, and it will continue to increase, which will further decline the purchasing power of the citizens. Another problem is the energy prices. Due to continuity of Russia-Ukraine war, the energy prices are slightly volatile at the moment. Although the prices came down since the start of the war, but they are still volatile. The government will continue to restrict imports to curtail the current account deficit, because this is the only easiest possible solution for the government to restrict the current account balance. But due to import restrictions, the economic activity in the country will slow down, and the manufacturing sector will also slow down. And in the end, the exchange rate will continue to experience pressure. PKR will remain subdued due to higher external financial obligations. So these are the challenges that will continue to slow down the economic activity, and resultantly it is expected that our GDP growth will also remain subdued.